You come from Mr. King, you best not miss. Ethan, I've started recording now.
So is this it then? We're going to talk about The Wire, finally.
Yeah.
It's taken a while, hasn't it?
But we started talking about The Wire at the end of the Sopranos podcast we last did, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think this has been in the running for a while, hasn't it?
Well, what happened, I think, is you started watching The Sopranos, and by the time you'd kind of reached about halfway through, I'd started watching The Wire. Then you got fear of missing out, so you dropped The Sopranos to start watching The Wire.
Yeah, it was a little bit of that. More me being frustrated with a lot of the characters in The Sopranos and just needing a break from them.
So we're not going to finish the series of Sopranos podcast for a while.
No, I think Christmas time we'll get back on it and we'll do 5 and 6 once I finish watching those seasons. But The Wire, it was more the fact that I had this rule, which I'll come onto in a minute, but it was hearing you talk about it. And it was hearing you talk about how much you really enjoyed the show and you were properly getting into the good stuff. And I think it was when you got to Series 3, when it was new territory for me, talking to me about it, hearing what you had to say about it, really made me want to watch the show.
That's fair enough. So you'd seen Series 1 and 2 before?
That's right, yeah. I'd seen Seasons 1 and Seasons 2, maybe when I was about 16. I think it might have been around then. And I really loved the first series, and I thought the second one was really fantastic as well. But I stopped watching for a few reasons. I think going back to revisit the show, I've remembered, I think, more accurately why I stopped watching the show. And I think it was probably to do with how tragic the character deaths were. You know, a lot of the first and second series is... Well, there aren't actually that many character deaths in the show, to be honest, but the ones that I really cared about, the ones that I was rooting for, they were the ones being killed off, and I think it was just...
Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there's a certain death in Series 2. That's the big one.
And there's 2 as well. There's another one that's quite big later on. Really, really big. But it wasn't just that. It was also the fact that the show was starting to become very complicated. I think at 16 years old, I was struggling to keep track. The first couple of seasons, I think I was old enough to follow quite closely what was going on. But Series 3 is so kind of heavily focused on politics and crime stats, and then things seemed to be going way over my head. So I thought, I'll stop. I'll give it a few years because I don't want to. You can only ever watch a show for the first time once, and that's what I try to keep in mind. I mean, considering what I knew about. Not so much Series 3, but Series 4, I've heard so many people say on the internet, people that I know who have watched the show, who all say Series 4, best series of TV has ever been made. And I didn't want to go into that, not really being able to follow what was going on. I think I was still too young to get into it, so I mean, I had no problem stopping. Yeah, and I mean, the reason that I got into it the first time around was just because I'd heard so many great things about it. I mean, it's such a popular TV show, and it really is one of those things that paved the way for TV at the start of the 2000s, along with shows like The Sopranos.
Yeah, although I think The Wire has a different story where it wasn't the most popular show.
No, it wasn't. It actually took quite a long time for it to become a hit. I think it was maybe after even the 5th season when the show had come to an end. But people kind of look back and it developed this sort of cult status. But yeah, I think when it first aired, it wasn't quite the success that you assume it would be, considering what you know about the show.
I think that pretty much the rumour was like at every season they kind of had to fight to not get cancelled. It's always a thing. And I think, I mean, we'll talk about the first season here, but the second season is probably the most talked about and kind of controversial, even though it's still very good, just because of how different it is. I think a large point of that is maybe because the first season wasn't as popular, and they're like, okay, we need to do something different, maybe mix it up.
I mean, it's like I said this to you when we first started talking about the show. It's basically the water level equivalent of a TV show, in the sense that it's about dock workers, quite heavily focused on. But it's not just that. I mean, the first season, it's kind of it's very dedicated to showing one particular case, and you spend time with these characters, and you've grown to learn that the conflict at the heart of the show is going to be McNulty and his troops, and Stringer and Avon and their troops. And to have this season that kind of comes out of nowhere and says, you know what, we'll put that on hold for a minute, and actually we'll show you this other side of Baltimore. I think that can be quite hard to get into for some people.
Yeah.
That's probably why it has that.
Because it's not the structure of kind of TV, is it? You spend so long introducing people to this world, like this kind of drug trade. But it makes sense, because if you're going to talk about it, you can't talk about the drug trade. It's almost, okay, so in series 1, they start talking about following the money. And it's almost doing that. It's like, okay, so where do the drugs come from? Who's controlling that? Who's profiting from that, And then as you go on, you've got who's really profiting. The high-level decision-making in the politics of the police and the government, and how that impacts schools, and how that leads to the drug trade. It's kind of, to really talk about the drug trade, you kind of have to talk about everything. But if season 1, episode 1 had started with the newspaper, the ports, the politics, it would be too much. They had to kind of slowly build it over time. I think that's kind of why maybe season 2, when you first start watching it, might be like really shocking.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the thought was going into it, because I don't know if Simon and Burns actually had a proper plan for all of the seasons. But knowing what I do know, how each season tries to focus on kind of a new topic, or you still follow the same crew. It's still McNulty, it's still the cops, and it's always the police in reference to something else.
Yeah.
It's always kind of something new.
It's the police fighting kind of the drug war.
Yeah, from different angles. And it's when you take a step back and you kind of go, all right, series 1 is about that primary case, right? It's a great introduction. Series 2, you've got the dock workers and the union. Series 3, that's when the politicians really start to become involved. Series 4 is the education system. And Series 5, you've got the newspapermen, right? You take a step back and you realise actually what they've been trying to do all along is just paint a canvas of Baltimore from a crime perspective. And I think that's what really makes... It's what makes every season matter, actually. The fact that it's able to do that, and still somehow have that same kind of set of characters flow throughout each season while introducing new ones and killing some off or having them just move on. It's really quite impressive. I think they've been able to tackle so many different issues, show so many different angles, perspectives, and still have that same core team of McNulty, Greggs, Daniel's kind of in charge of them, but he moves away at times, and everything's always changing and shifting. It's never really stationary.
Yeah, it never feels like an issue of the week show where it's like, okay, these are the things we're tackling. I think there's a level of authenticity and complete believability in The Wire. It's just very well written. I think the thing I heard was that none of the people in the writers' room were screenwriters. They were all novelists, journalists, kind of people with a really grounded background. So a lot of the dialogue is expositional. I think you said to me the other day, a lot of it is kind of explaining things. It's characters having conversations about what's happening. But it never feels like you're watching, I don't know, a documentary or anything like that. But it's that authenticity, I think, and believability, and the fact that the writers are writing things they know about. That David Simon was a journalist in Baltimore. He covered the drug trade.
Same with Ed Burns. He was a police officer turned school teacher, which is exactly what one of the best characters ends up doing.
And like the consultants they got on the show, like they talked to people that I heard their stories. Like the fact that Omar, who before going into The Wire, the one thing I knew about was there was this great character called Omar. I didn't know anything about him. He was basically a real guy.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there was a huge commitment to try and have just as much authenticity as you possibly could. I know that the showrunners often talk to the cast members and the crew who kind of lived in Baltimore to try and get a really accurate portrayal of the city from kind of areas that they knew a little bit less about. And I think they were encouraged to kind of speak out if something didn't feel right. If there was a particular line of dialogue that didn't quite gel well, or if a character had a particular motivation that in that context wouldn't quite make sense, I think they were encouraged to speak up, which is really, really good. And then obviously you got the great thing where a lot of like we talk about with Felicia Pearson and other actors, they were kind of locals of the area, and I think that really goes a long way to trying to realise a show like this. I mean, it's one thing to watch a TV show or a film where the people who are in charge of the show kind of know very little, and that comes across, but when people have done their research and they know the place that they live in so well, it really, really comes across. I mean, when you watch 5 seasons of a TV show like that, I've never personally lived in Baltimore, but I kind of feel like I have. There is always that sense of detachment because you're watching a TV show, obviously. But I feel like I know that city quite well just from having watched a TV show.
They do a good job of, especially in season 1, like introducing this character. They go to these key places, and then you know which characters go to which places, and then you might learn the names of the street corners. You're like, okay, so they go here, they go here, they go here, and you start to associate. And then I think it does that to kind of build in your mind like how this system works. It is introducing you to a new world. There's re-ups. There's corner boys. They're kind of, this is the area where it operates, and also you kind of, as they're slowly building the investigation in season 1, you're slowly getting more and more understanding of the kind of Barksdale organisation. And I think it does a good job of very slowly introducing you to this kind of world.
Definitely. I always saw series 1 as a prologue. It's a prelude. It's the city in the simplest term. You have the task force, and you have people they're trying to fight against. And there's not. You can feel external factors acting upon these characters, but you don't really see them. And the show tends to develop that in later seasons. But that first case, I think that first season, it's just trying to get you used to this world before it can, kind of have fun with different angles and different perspectives. And when you look at later seasons and you have, I think off the top of my head in series 1, the only character who's kind of not law enforcement or drug trade is probably Bubs, right, off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But you look at later seasons, and it actually got this really kind of wide array of characters from different backgrounds, and it's not just those 2 different systems.
Even then, Bubs is kind of in the show in the context that he's an informant.
Yeah.
Whereas as the show goes on, you kind of follow Bubs' life completely kind of divorced from helping the police or anything.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of streamlined in that way. I wonder what it would be like. I mean, you've seen season 1 twice now, obviously, a few years apart. I wonder what it would be like now finishing the show and kind of seeing where it ends up, how season 1 would play, because I think it is very slow. It's 13 episodes, I think. Or 12.
Yeah, 13.
And it does take its time. I mean, one of the things I found like really incredible was that it's an episode to get everyone together, but it's only really episodes kind of 3 where they actually start working on the case.
Yeah.
And just the really small progress that will be made on the investigation.
I mean, I think the biggest sign of that is the fact that they don't even know what their target looks like until about 3 or 4 episodes in. They just have a name, Avon Barksdale. You feel like these characters are really starting off from scratch. They do have to build a case from the bottom up. Whereas in later seasons, they can't really do as much, and they kind of just throw you in straight away, right? We have Marlowe, but you haven't been here for a year, and we're just going to throw you straight into it when we already have quite a solid case. You don't really see that time that it takes to actually build the case. They're already on it. That's what I really appreciate about the first series. You really see it from the start to the very end when Avon gets caught and he gets put away. I really like that, and it is slow paced, but I have a lot of admiration for a show that wants to take its time. And I actually don't even think it is that slow paced. I remember it being very, very kind of drawn out and long winded, and in a really great way, and in a way that was still enthralling and engaging. But going back to rewatch the first series now, I actually. It's not slow paced in the sense that it's slow paced because nothing's really happening. There's so much kind of congestion and there's so much plot still going on in that first season that the ball still feels rolling. It is just kind of slow, and like I said, it is about starting from the ground up. You don't really have a strong foundation. You've just got to kind of go from the beginning and see where it ends up, really.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. And I like that. And it's actually, I think another thing that's so great about the first series in terms of realism is how coincidence kind of takes a back seat. You have a lot of these TV shows, Game of Thrones is another one, where you have such a huge amount of characters that when they kind of get chucked together, it feels a bit contrived. But what's really great about the first series is this task force gets assembled from people all over the place. And, later on in the series, you have Burrell and other characters trying to shut this task force down because it's getting a bit too close to the real problem. And I like those things because it really does feel like in series 4 when you have Bubs run into Prez at the school, it's kind of a bit not quite fan servicey, but it feels like I don't know, you kind of just want an excuse to chuck these characters in a scene for the sake of them being both in a scene. And I like how the first series is like, alright, we'll just have all these characters from all sorts of different backgrounds, we'll chuck them in a room together and we'll have them introduce themselves to each other. That feels realistic to me.
Definitely. I feel like it does a good job of the character introductions as well. Because you could very easily, like, the first time you see Avon, he can beating someone to death in his bare hands. It's like, but you meet him like he's just a guy, you know. D'Angelo, you see him getting off and killing a witness. Kind of comes at the end of that episode. But he's maybe one of the most sympathetic characters in the show, you know. And on the other side, I guess you see the police, and you know, like one of the first scenes is the kind of guy in charge of the murder police giving him the finger for actually wanting to investigate a murder.
Yeah.
Just things like that. I think it does a pretty good job of not kind of having one side be complete heroes and one side being complete villains, and it shows you pretty well with characters like Wallace that, you know, that people who, if you look at their rap sheet, they're criminals, but they're not. You know, they're real human beings who are kind of trying their best to survive. And it's, as the show goes on, I guess it is in season 1, but more and more, it's the real villain is the system. You know, I mean, that's what's.
I think the other great thing going off of that is that I think when you look at it in a general sense, what you have is law enforcement being quite immoral, and then I guess the lower level management of the drug trade just trying to get by, and that's the general kind of consensus. But I feel like when you look into that and you look at the individuals, they're very kind of morally shady, and things just aren't black and white, and I really like that.
It's almost like season 1 has the 2 institutions of the Barstow Organisation and the Baltimore City Police. And the higher you go up in each of the institutions, there's kind of more corruption going on. The low level players on either side, I mean, they're just there because that's how they make their living. You know? And they almost like don't really give a shit.
But you can take the most sympathetic characters, and they're still not perfect. Like you just mentioned, D'Angelo. I mean, he has killed people, and somehow the writers have managed to create this character who you have an immense amount of empathy towards. In fact, and we've talked about this, looking back, the only character who I think really has just such a great moral compass and isn't trying to do anything malicious at all is Bubs. And maybe Wallace, in fact, actually, in the first series before his unfortunate end comes. But even Bubs, I mean, at the end of the 4th series, he wants to poison someone. And, you know, getting him to that point, well, we'll talk about that more later on, but getting him to that point, he's still sympathetic. You understand why he's doing it, and you don't really dislike him for it. You take all these characters, and then even the characters on the opposite end of the spectrum, the ones who you dislike, the ones who are kind of more morally reprehensible, they're still not totally evil. They still have good traits, they still have traits about them that kind of make them a bit more likeable. I think as you kind of get along more in the show, you got characters like Marlowe, who I think are a bit too far gone for me to have any kind of likeness for. But you know, you gotta have different characters that fulfill different purposes, and different characters that are kind of more one extreme than the other. You can't have them just be completely morally ambiguous. So it is good to have characters like Marlowe. That's definitely a strength of the show, for sure.
Series 1, we've got kind of Avon and Stringer, right? What do you think about them as characters?
So actually, I'll ask you really quickly. You don't really. I think it's more through the lens of Series 3 that you find their relationship a bit more kind of generic in the first series.
Maybe, but that might just be me misremembering. I mean, I feel like Stringer's more notable just because I know who Idris Elba is. I feel like the character, you have more scenes of Stringer than you do of Avon. Because Stringer is almost, maybe you could see it as he's the one in charge, but I always felt like he was doing things to protect Avon. Avon was kind of, I remember one of the early scenes as Avon just like looking out a window, and like, you know, he's like incredibly cautious, like doesn't want to show his face really. Unless he absolutely has to.
No, it makes sense. I mean, they have a close bond, and that's why when they slowly kind of drift away in the Series 3, it has that much more power to it.
Yeah, I think this is rushing right ahead, but Series 2 does a great thing of... Series 1, every scene of them, they're very aware they're being watched, so they're very cautious about what they're saying, and obviously pretty much every phone call you're aware is being wiretapped. Series 1 is like the wire, like there is a wire, and it's like a big part of the show.
Yeah.
As the seasons go on, there's like not really a wire anymore. But series 2, because of reasons we'll probably get into, there isn't that pressure. So their conversations suddenly are more open, and they're not being investigated. And seeing kind of how their organisation deals with what happens in series 1, I think is really one of the great things about series 2. That by focusing on a different main plot, their subplot can get stronger and stronger. So by the time we get to series 3, and they are the main plot again, it's just so much stronger for me. But that might just be because I've had 2 seasons worth of investment now.
No, I think you're right. I mean, if you look at Stringer and Avon as a relationship more than as 2 individual characters, it definitely isn't strongest in series 3 when it's just pretty much just, I mean, you can't even recognise these characters and their relationship anymore. And in the first series, I think more than anything, they play a role as the faces who are in charge. And you do get a sense of the character. I think even in the first series, you can see that Idris Elba is more of a businessman. He is more of a kind of a forward thinker, whereas Avon is like the street is the street, and that's never going to change.
Yeah, and I guess those points by series 3 get pushed to such an extreme.
Such extremes.
It becomes way more apparent.
Yeah. But I think the first series, I mean, when you go on Google and you type in The Wire Season 1, you don't get photos of Stringer and Avon. You get photos of D'Angelo and his crew. I think that's what that season is more concerned with. D'Angelo, Bodie, Wallace, Poot as well. Great nicknames. And I think when you look at the drug trade in the first series especially, it's about the lower levels. It's about the people out there, like the pawns on the chessboard. They're the ones who are actually in the line of fire. They're the ones who are actually running the risk doing the work for not that much reward.
And like, let's rush ahead to every season of The Wire kind of ends in a similar way. I always feel like it's always like a bittersweet ending. And if we're talking about D'Angelo, I think the real tragedy is Wallace's death, and it's the fact that D'Angelo doesn't rap. I mean, obviously, we talked in the Trainspotting podcast about, like the guy steals it, rap. But he takes the years, and obviously we see how that plays out in season 2.
Yeah.
But that moment where he looks like he's going to get out of the game, make a life for himself, but he's kind of convinced for kind of stupid reasons not to. I feel like that's kind of a real tragedy.
Yeah, and it's just how unjust and unfair everything is. Avon is the guy who's in charge of the organisation. If anyone's going to go away for a long time, it has to be him. But when it comes down to it, D'Angelo gets caught doing something very kind of minute and stupid, but he goes away for 20 years or something like that. And Avon, he's the guy in charge who only goes away for 5, and then he's out by series 3 as well. It's just completely stacked. It's completely stacked. I think that's kind of a big part of series 2, especially for D'Angelo, early on, at least. Yeah. But I do know what you mean. Every season ends in that way where it's kind of like, well, we sort of did what we wanted, but there's always kind of a catch, and you kind of look back and you think, well, I was happy to be there for the ride, but nothing's really changed. If anything, things have kind of gotten worse.
Yeah, it's always like they take a step forward and 2 steps back.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it.
If we're going to talk about like a character in the show, I think we should really talk about Omar, because we've said about the binary kind of cops, robbers, good, bad, that the show tries to blur. But then Omar is almost this wild card character who is completely kind of in the middle of that, where I see why he's like, not knowing anything about Omar, I'm like, okay, I get why everyone likes Omar.
Well, yeah, it's because he kind of, he belongs in an institution in the sense that he's caught up between 2, but he is that lone wolf character, right? He's not a cop, he's not a drug dealer, he's somewhere kind of in between. I think that's the real appeal with his character. He kind of runs his own game. He's not really... He has his own rules. He doesn't have to abide by the rules that people kind of enforce on. And I think that's what's really cool about him. He's the vigilante character, the one who kind of... I think what really helps him in Series 1 a lot is the fact that through emotional reasons, he's forced to kind of be quite a big help in taking down Avon and Stringer towards the end, being that informant character. And I think the show kind of cements quite quickly on he is a likable character, and that he's someone who can actually kind of enforce a change on an individual level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's coming. I think it helps the fact that he's not in the show every episode. Like he kind of pops up when he's needed.
Yeah.
And every scene of Omar is like a million people just to say his name. So I think that definitely helps.
Yeah. You definitely get a lot of scenes of Omar walking somewhere and characters just running away saying, "Oh, Omar's coming."
Also, especially in season 1, where he's got the whistle, he's got the shotgun. I feel like I feel like he is just like a very iconic character.
Yeah, and the other thing about Omar that's so great, right, is that he is stylized in the way that, he's got the shotgun, he's got the black coat, he's got the I don't know what you call them, but it's almost like a gel cap that he wears, and there is something there is something a little bit glamorous about that. But he's not so stylized that it goes beyond credibility, if that makes sense. He's still a character that you could imagine living in that, especially when you find out that he's based off of a real person. I think David Simon once talked to, who robbed drug dealers. It makes that credibility seem even more, even more credible, for sure. He's definitely a great character.
Yep.
You good?
Yep.
I think I've pretty much said everything that I had to say about Omar.
That's fair enough.
Do you want something else?
Yeah. When you think about season 1 The Wire, Ethan, what do you think about?
Probably D'Angelo and Wallace. I was sold on The Wire because going into it, I knew that the show was going to be quite, like you said earlier, it wasn't going to be cops good, criminals bad. It was going to be a lot more kind of sort of even keeled in that way. It wasn't going to be very, very clearly these guys are good and these guys are bad. I think there's two characters in the first series that really hammer that point home, and that's why I really like them as much as I do. And that is D'Angelo and that is Wallace as well. I think D'Angelo's probably a big one for me, just because of his fate and just how upsetting it is when that actually happens. Especially the brutality of what does happen to him.
The library surprise.
D'Angelo's library surprise. But I don't think it's just that. I think he really cares about Wallace, and I think that goes a long way to you really liking that character. He looks after his crew. For him, it's not just a business in the sense that I think Avon not as much, but Stringer is someone I think, like you said, he's very careful. If someone's causing a problem, he suspects someone. Not to the same extent Marlowe does, where Marlowe is just full out ruthless. Anyone talking to the cops, anyone with the cops, they have to go. But Stringer is very, very cautious, and I think he feels anyone who's a problem has to go, and that's the reason why D'Angelo does go, because there's always that possibility. But for D'Angelo, it's a different game completely. He cares about the people that he works with, and with Wallace, it's more to do with how horrible his living conditions are. I think he is really, in the first series, Wallace is really the epitome of a character who I think hasn't really done well in school, kind of dropped out, and he's kind of been forced into this life of crime because, firstly, it's easy money, and secondly, he doesn't really have the skills to do anything else or the qualifications for it, so he's forced into this life.
He also kind of cares for like a bunch of kids, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
He kind of acts as a parent for a bunch of kids.
That's probably one of the most striking openings as well. There's an episode in the first series where you see his morning routine, and it goes on for a couple of minutes. I think the whole thing is just one shot, which is pretty good as well. I love one shots. But it's just him living in this kind of almost vacant-looking house with about 7 or 8 kids. I mean, not even that much younger than he is, and considering he's what, maybe 14 years old, 15? He can't be any more than that. And he has to look after these kids and make sure they get to school, make sure they have their packet of crisps and their packed lunches and stuff like that. Pooh's living with them as well. And I think it's really bleak. I think it's definitely a good starting off point for what's to come in Series 4. I think it's probably one of the best openings in this show, and it's actually one of the openings that I remembered really well going back to watching it 3 or 4 years later. That opening shot of just something as menial as someone getting ready for their day, as someone who is going to to deal drugs, it just really stuck with me because it is powerful. It's really powerful.
Yeah, I think it really is.
Yeah.
What about? I mean, it's kind of telling that we haven't mentioned him, but the main character of the show, which is McNulty.
Yeah, it's funny when we talked about The Sopranos. A lot of our conversation revolved around the main character, Soprano, because the show is Tony Soprano. It's about how he develops over the course of the show.
It really is a character piece. It's about the psychology of the character, his kind of inner demons. But this is really isn't.
No, it really isn't. Don't get me wrong. The Wire is about individuals trying to survive in systems. No doubt about that one bit. But I think McNulty is the main character in the sense that he's in the first scene of the show. And that's all there is to it. That's McNulty.
Yeah.
McNulty is McNulty. I think being in the 5th series now, I can look back and say there's a lot more bark to him and meat to him than originally you think. He kind of feels not two-dimensional, but he has very little character to him. He's pretty much just...
like he's a bit of an archetype and he's self-destructive, kind of alcoholic.
Yeah. He sleeps around and he drinks, and that's kind of his character in the first series. And then as you go on, I think you learn more about his character. You mentioned he's self-destructive. You definitely get a lot of that. He's very obsessive. I think he has quite an inflated opinion of himself. You see a lot of that in Series 3. So there's definitely a character to him, but you just don't get that much in the first series. And I think the only reason that you do think of him as a main character is because he's in the show quite a lot. But he's not that interesting compared to other characters. I think when he's on screen, I kind of go, oh, McNulty. Well, Series 5, I'm always happy to see McNulty on screen. It's just so fun. But in the first series, I didn't really... He's a tool more than anything. And that's all there really is to McNulty, I think.
I guess his kind of pessimistic attitude is kind of reflected in the outcome of the investigations. Because I think if there's one point the Wire is trying to make about the war on drugs, is that it didn't work and it won't work. And we're going to show you the reasons why it won't work. Because the way to police it is not the way that works immediately, you know. And it doesn't work with like violence and force. Because if you cut off the head of a snake, 2 will come back.
Exactly. I think all in all, maybe the most depressing thing about the show is you watch a season of it and they're following someone. And you know that if they catch that person by the end of the season, someone's just going to take their place. It's an infinite cycle. You catch Avon, he's going to go to prison, but there's still going to be remnants. You're still going to have Stringer. And even if Stringer went alongside, there's always going to be a Marlowe to take its place. There's always going to be that gap in the market for someone to come and try and fill.
Because there's always going to be addicts, There's the kind of opioid crisis in America where people need help, or they need kind of support to kind of help their addictions and help them recover. Whereas really the very little money in cities, what's left of it is being thrown at the police to try and stop the problem. Whereas really you need kind of more services to kind of help people.
Yeah.
And then.
Yeah, because. Maybe this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but I think often a lot of the time, if you exclude other reasons like peer pressure and things like that, people take drugs because of mental health issues. And that's really what you've got to try and tackle. And that's really, I think, one of the main focuses of Series 4. Without going into too much detail, Colvin sets up this thing with someone else to try and look at the psychology of the characters who get involved in this business to try and understand what it is. And I think that a lot of the time it is due to mental health. It's to do with a feeling of emptiness or feeling hollow inside and wanting to try and fill that somehow with a sense of elation.
I think that's what makes 3 and 4 in particular a cut above the rest. Because then suddenly you've got the dynamics of people in the communities trying to help. Like you've got characters like Colvin, you've got Patty, you've got people who, like I guess Presbyterian is one series for who are in the police, but they're almost trying to kind of help.
Yeah.
From a different angle. And like the things they're doing still are and having a big impact on people who are inside the game.
Definitely, but having said that, it's still not enough to just have people look at individuals, right? Because you're never going to change something if you just look at targeting specific people like Neyman and trying to help them specifically. And that's the frustrating thing about watching some episodes of The Wire where you have police officers who are just concerned about doing street rips. They think that they'll be able to street rip themselves out of this crisis. And really it's not about that. Really what I think matters a lot is what Carcetti gets up to in later seasons. I think the real responsibility to try and help the city comes with the politicians who have that power. And unfortunately they get stuck in all sorts of other kind of broken aspects, which makes it really hard for them to try and solve this issue in the way they want to. And that's the thing about McNulty, right? I don't think there's anything really bad about him. I think he's actually kind of a decent guy, and he is motivated by good reasons. He does want to help and do some good, but a lot of the time he kind of he just gets too frustrated and too bogged down in specific details, and it just kind of drives him to do very irresponsible things, and that's the hard thing to kind of get with McNulty.
I think even if you are a police officer within the system, and a lot of the characters in The Wire are, I think they used to make this point, you have the most noble intentions, and you've never done a thing wrong in your life, and even if everyone was like, we're going to do the right thing, the police are utilised almost as like a tool by the kind of government. Like they're almost the only thing they can do effectively is their hammer. They can kick in doors, they can do street rips, when Kima gets shot, it's that response, that ridiculous response, all these resources that weren't allocated to this investigation now just sort of kicking down doors.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work, and it's just this kind of show of force, and that's kind of all they really have.
And it really says something that in that entire part of Series 1 towards the end, where one person who gets shot doesn't die, and another person who gets shot and does die, but because Kima's the police officer and Orlando is just some guy who owns a bar that was a front for Avon, no one would have cared if he died. That wouldn't have... The budget that task force would have had, the resources that they would have had, would not have been impacted unless Kima had been shot. Fatally wounded, sure, but she didn't die. But still, you're right, that call to response is just... It's astounding because one of their own got shot and they can't let that stand. But, I mean, it's such a big point in Series 5. Like, it's almost... Again, without going into too much, it's almost kind of funny how much the dialogue now is devoted to 22 African American characters die, but if you have one white character die, then all the resources are going to get allocated to that. And, Marlo can get away with killing 22 people, but no one gives a damn. That's not where the focus is going to be. It's almost kind of funny at that point how much they talk about it in the 5th season. And you get that in Series 1. A cop gets shot, doesn't die, but all of a sudden you've got the commissioner coming down, and the deputy commissioner, and these colonels, and everyone kind of goes around to try and help us. In
Series 1, when you're in that point watching it, it might seem irrational, and it seems irrational now, but when you've got to Series 5 and you see, suddenly the politicians like Carcetti are being attacked by the newspapers, and that's going to hurt their future chances. So they tell the deputy of ops and commissioner, you need to sort this now. I need a good headline, and then they tell you understand the full chain, and you can rewatch season 1. I'm guessing with that kind of knowledge in mind of why things happen.
Yeah, because like I said earlier in the podcast, you don't see the external forces, but you definitely still feel them in the first season. Yeah. And it's really nice to actually... Because I think you said that you kind of had a little problem with that, because you feel like later on in the show, the system is kind of represented by individuals a little bit too much rather than as a system. It's easier to blame Royce for his fuck-ups and just say it's Royce's problem.
Yeah, I think it was more... I think it's kind of... If you're trying to... The Wire's strength is it's making systemic critique about systems, and ideology, rather than just what a lot of things do, the kind of liberal worldview of it. It's a few bad apples, It's not that the police are utilised by politicians to kind of act in a racist way against kind of people, because that's, I don't know. I guess in the 90s they were like, okay, we can implement these racist crime bills, we can hit down on crack cocaine harder, to stop these dealers, the kind of Hillary Clinton super predators. It's easier to do that than it is to criticise the system. It's easier to go there's just a few bad apples rather than this is a system. But as The Wire goes on, eventually you pretty much know everyone in the system. Like every character up to the mayor is like a character that you know pretty well. I guess at that point, it's harder to kind of criticize the system and not just be like, oh, now Cocketty's talking to this person, you know.
Yeah.
You know the faces behind the
That's
system.
one of the most impressive things about The Wire, and that's really what helps it in Series 3 and Series 4, where you just have this sheer amount of characters on the screen who you're always following. It's there is so much of a sense of cause and effect. Everything has a consequence. When someone makes a decision up top, it trickles down and everyone feels it. And I really, really appreciate that about the show. You know, it's not like an action will happen and then the reaction will be kind of minimal. Everyone feels everything. And that's such a vital part of bringing The Wire to life, I think.
Mm. And we haven't even talked about just elements like it's incredible kind of writing of each episode with the really naturalistic dialogue. I think it's pretty well directed. It's nothing like it's not like a film. It's still TV.
No, it is. And actually, I'd say when it comes to kind of you're right. We haven't barely talked about kind of I guess the more kind of televisual aspects of the show. We've been so concerned about the politics and things like that. If I had one flaw, it's I've never been a big fan of having the camera move sideways as it's focusing on a character and then talking. You see that a lot in kind of CSI and those kinds of TV shows, and I feel like it's a little bit cheap, and I'm not a big fan of it in The Wire as much. But I mean, it's a 20-year-old show. You're gonna have kind of techniques like that, so you just film the scene.
Yeah. It never feels dated though. It's never like occasionally when I watch The Sopranos, I'm like, okay, this was the first I can see, but this is like a tiny bit dated. Because The Wire, you could release The Wire today and it would be as good.
Yeah.
I don't think you don't have to be like, oh, maybe this element's not aged as well. I think The Wire plays as well today as it did in 2002. I think that's why it's probably got the reputation it has, because you can give someone the DVD now, Jonathan, and if they watch it, they'll be like, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a novel for TV. A good one as well.
If you had if you had a flaw, or if you were recommending the show to someone and you said, oh, this is all great, everything's great about it, but there is this one thing that, it's kind of, it's a bit undeveloped, it's maybe not executed in the best way. Is there anything that comes to mind immediately?
I don't know. I mean, I think that season kind of 2 and 5 are slightly worse. So I guess but that's like most TV shows have that problem.
I guess if I had, no, that's true. I guess if I had two things I would probably say to people, it's almost, well, one of them is almost like a subconscious thing that I now do just from all the YouTube videos that I've watched and just kind of the fact that we live in 2020, which I'll get onto in a second. But one thing is that it is a complicated show.
You do have to pay attention.
You do have to pay attention, yeah. I mean, it's not so much that the dialogue is delivered in kind of a fast-paced way. It's more in the sense that everything is relevant.
Every piece matters. Yeah.
They don't say lines if they don't mean nothing. Everything has a role. And a lot of the time it will be about moving the plot forward, but a lot of the time it will be D'Angelo going tap tap tap, and then McNulty going tap tap tap, and it will be those kinds of links there that don't really drive the plot forward, but they still kind of shine through.
There's that. I think it does train you though, because as you were saying when you first started watching the show, and maybe stopped at series 3 because it was too much. Series 1 kind of trains you for that, because there's that great scene where Lester marks just a really throwaway phone call as pertinent, and he's telling to Brzezowski it all matters, and it's the slow building of the investigation where you'll like, I don't know, because of the way the investigation is set up, you'll see someone do something on the phone or say something in a scene where you're following everyone on streams people, and then you'll know what that means in terms of the investigation. Like, okay, that means that they're going to do this and they're going to do that.
Yeah. It's because you see both sides. One of them isn't anonymous to the other.
So as it opens up more and more, it trains you to follow along with it pretty well.
I'd say. It definitely does.
But you can't
and even more complicated techniques like the wiretap and things like that. But they kind of explain them in sort of I don't want to say spoon feeding, because it's not spoon feeding, but they do kind of dumb it down a little bit so that, when you see the phone number or you see the pager number, the way that Lester explains that, it's in a way that we can kind of understand, so that he doesn't really have to explain that again. When you see that phone number when you see the wiretap on his computer screens, you know how it works.
I guess maybe a problem, not a massive problem, is just that, like, maybe because of the wire, we know what certain things are. Like, we know what like a burner phone is now.
Sure.
And like, obviously in season 3, that was probably a thing that most people in their daily lives had never heard of.
Yeah.
Burner phones for crimes existed.
It is quite funny when they do take a big chunk out of that episode in Series 3 to explain to the characters and audience what a burner phone is. You don't need to do this. I know what a burner phone is. I know that they're disposable. This is how they work. Out of interest, right? You know what's really funny? When you watch an episode of The Wire now, you just think, okay, Lester, he's just probably the most competent character in the show, no doubt. But in Series 1, do you remember how it's almost a plot twist that he's good at his job?
Yeah, I think I watched it with my dad, and he spoiled that. Because he was like, I remember this guy, he's great. Because he's just kind of in the corner whittling wood. And he's the one that gets the photo they want.
It does. Towards the start of the first series, he's the one who's kind of like, his mind is sort of always constantly working and fully functioning. And he goes out and does something, you don't really understand what he's doing until he comes back and pretty much just says, here it is.
Yeah.
Hands the file on Daniel's desk and just says, I basically did this work for you. And people kind of realise...
Series 1 does have this kind of underdog story, doesn't it? Where it's a bunch of kind of... It's weird to say the police are underdogs in American society, especially in the context of The Wire. But it's a bunch of people thrown in together because this case kind of exists because McNulty bitch about to a judge.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is when you look at the task force at the start, it's pretty much just a bunch of kind of failures in their departments thrown together. It is an underdog story, and it's because Burrell wants it to fail. It's his decision to put these unlikely characters together who are kind of not particularly great at their job. A couple of which can't wait to retire. They don't really do much.
Yeah, a couple of which retire, a couple of which, like the first or second episode, go to a tower block just to get in a fight with some random kids, you know?
Yeah. And it's almost like it is destined to fail. It's destined to go nowhere. And the real thing is that what Burrell wants is just go after Avon and just get Avon. We want him for a few years. We don't care about anything else. And I think what makes Lester really great, and I guess Prez also, is that they're not really interested in Avon. They're interested in the money, like you said earlier. It's all about trying to figure out this entire network, how everything works and comes together. And
the really kind of disappointing thing about the ending, not disappointing, it's great, but for the characters it's disappointing, is that they can't carry on because they're only, it's like a meme, but they're only interested in terrorism cases and corruption cases, which is, this show came out about a year after 9/11, maybe even less, in a time when the war on drugs was ending and the war on terror was starting. And it almost kind of been forgotten, the war on drugs. Like this massive thing for 2 decades. It was pretty much like the American cultural war, where all the resources are going to be pumped in. Suddenly they're just stopping it, and it's like, well, what happens now? Well, it's kind
they've got to make do with what they've got, pretty much. Yeah.
And pretty much nothing has changed. And the people that are suffering at the hands of it are the people that are the poorest, and the people that are poorest in America for various systemic issues are black people. And I feel like the show, for a show which has white writers and white creators, it doesn't feel insensitive or misjudged. I feel like they've talked to their cast, they've delegated responsibilities, they've talked to people who are affected by these issues, and I feel like they've done a really good job of making something that feels really authentic and really kind of progressive, I guess.
Definitely. When you've lived in Baltimore and you know what the demographic is like in that city, and going along with the idea that I think when you're a white writer writing stories about black people, it's kind of easy to think of it in sort of a homogenized sense, if that makes sense. Whereas if you're writing a show where 90-95% of the cast are African American and there's only really a handful of white characters, it's almost difficult to kind of fuck up in that sense, because when you're trying to write so many characters and give them unique experiences, when all those characters predominantly are black, then you are going to have that extremely very nuanced portrayal of these characters,
Yeah.
I mean, they get caught up in real world issues, but they're all so different. They really, really are. And it's not just them. I mean, the handful of white characters that you have in the show as well. are the same as well. You know, one experience isn't the same as another experience. The characters are unique. It's not homogenized, which I think is something that's quite easy to do if you're a white writer trying to write a story about black people. It's almost kind of easy to look at things as a unifying black experience, but of course that doesn't exist. It's not true because everyone's human. Everyone has their own experience, their own way through life.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it definitely does a good job of like talking a lot about racism, but not being something that's about racism. It's by analyzing these systems, which are kind of racist systems, it exposes those. And I think part of the success of the show is that it never lectures the audience about the ideology of the creators. It just presents things as they are, and you come at it with your own worldview. I'm sure that someone who's a lot more right wing than me would probably watch The Wire and come up to very different conclusions about what the problem is. So you kind of project yourself, like all great art, you kind of project yourself onto what's being presented. But what it does is it portrays not only a very entertaining story, but a very honest portrayal of what's kind of going on in Baltimore, which I think at the time probably wasn't as publicized. Like I think before The Wire, I don't know how many stories, if any stories, there were about kind of Baltimore, the Baltimore.
No, I mean it's a big city, and the biggest city in I think Maryland on the East Coast. But I mean, when you think about stories set in America, you think LA, New York, Chicago, they're the big ones. Baltimore, you're right. I don't think I've ever seen anything set in Baltimore apart from this.
It's not just that; it's like predominantly West Baltimore. It kind of really narrows it down to like a specific part. But by analyzing what is happening in this city, it's almost a microcosm for every American city. In that way, it's like this isn't just happening in Baltimore; it's happening all across the country. But by like being hyper specific and really genuine about one place, it can in a sense be a universal kind of thing.
Yeah. But it's also crazy because I feel like the show goes into so much detail with all sorts of things. I mean, even the geography of Baltimore. Like I mean, the amount of times that they go on about east side and west side and downtown and North Avenue and the corners, Fayette Street. Yeah, I mean, I know these places, and it's crazy that I do know these places, but I think that kind of goes to show how great The Wire can be in terms of when you're invested, you're invested. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons behind that. It has the Game of Thrones thing of, like, there's so many main characters, and most of them are never doing anything boring. But even if you spend enough time with one character that you kind of think, oh, can you just go away for a little bit now? There'll be another character that it just jumps to. There's so many different perspectives, so many different experiences that I feel like it's almost impossible not to get invested because there's going to be a character that you like. There has to be. It's almost kind of like a joke between us that when you get to Series 3, Series 4, there's so many characters that you're following that you just have to like some of them and have to root for them and want them to have a happy ending.
It's also just before you've got these characters you're invested in. It's the story being told, and like when we talked about The Sopranos, it's a lot earlier, and TV was more episodic. Everything would be wrapped up, and there's strengths and weaknesses to that. The Wire plot lines aren't resolved. You know, a plot line will start in episode 3, and you'd see a little bit, and maybe you wouldn't get anything in 4, you'd get a little bit in 5, and you'd get the resolution in 7 or 8. It's strands being told across episodes and across the season. And I think that kind of more approach that's more common in like different storytelling mediums before TV kind of came in and adopted it. The Wire was probably one of the first that did it, that made the show so successful. And I guess made it really different for the time. This kind of this long form, like it's not slow, but it's patient storytelling.
Yeah,
if we put this piece here, it's going to be more satisfying if that is resolved in a few episodes if you've been paying attention, rather than resolving it in 20 minutes.
Oh, definitely. I mean, with so many kind of B-rate and poorly written cop shows, detective shows, it's a new case per episode. But this is for the long haul, right?
Would you call The Wire a cop show? Do you think? Because it feels kind of reductive to do that. I'm not saying you were. I'm just saying
a little bit. I'd probably call it a crime drama if I had to give it any kind of genre name. But I'd probably call it a detective show. Yeah, I don't know what the split is like between the drug trade and then the law enforcement, and then even how the politicians come into it. But I would say it's probably roughly 50-50, right? You probably spend maybe a little bit more with law enforcement, I guess, just but ever so slightly. I might be I think if I was selling the show to someone, I probably would start off with the phrase, "It's a great detective show."
Yeah. I guess it's more like when you watch Law and Order, it's about law and order. It's the police, they're going to create law and order. Whereas even the victories in The Wire, can you say Law and Order have really been, they might have been for a few people, but not for the victims of who this is being affected by, not by the addicts, not by the people affected, not by people like Wallace who are kind of trapped in the game because they've got no way out.
Yeah. It's almost insane when I watch a season of this show, and I think back to plot incidents that have happened earlier in the season, and I can't believe they've been in the season. It feels like they are slow burns and they are slow paced, but to think of what they've been able to accomplish, the story they've been able to tell in one season, 13 episodes, is astounding what they've been able to fit in. At Series 4 especially, when I was getting to the end, I couldn't believe that the stuff with Royce and Herc at the start of that season was in the same season, because it felt like the plot had moved on so much since then that it wasn't even about that anymore.
Do you think we should wrap up talking about the first season and move on to the
second? We've barely talked about the first season. We just talked about the show as a whole pretty much, haven't we?
Yeah, I guess it's what we do with the season.
Yeah. I mean, is there more to say about the first season? I do love it a lot.
I guess it's hard. When we talk about Sopranos, it's easier to go into specific episodes. The Wire is different. The Wire, I think we've talked about Series 1 as if it was a whole. We talked about the ending, we talked about kind of characters and moments we haven't really talked about.
Can we talk about a few moments?
Yeah.
Are there ones that stand out?
I think the best individual scene and the one that's like, it's not really become a meme, but the chess scene is, that's such a brilliant kind of encapsulation.
Yeah. I think my favourite thing about that scene, which I talked about a little bit earlier, is it's expositional, but in a really satisfying sense, right? It's not a scene where it's like, let's just say, right, we need to get the DNRs and the public call records, and you go do this, and you go do that, and then we'll all come back at the end of the episode and see how we've got on. This is a scene where it's like, right, these are characters that are very kind of down to earth, and you're going to learn a bit about these characters in the scene, and you're going to learn a little bit about the system and how to kind of use something as use a game to explain how your organisation works, and I think it's so effective because it really does last, doesn't it? I mean, people look back at The Wire, when they think about scenes, the chess scene is one of the big ones.
There's definitely the chess scene. I mean, the scene where Bunker McNulty would just say "fuck,
motherfucker."
I think that's a pretty good scene.
Yeah, that is really good. But that's more a masterclass in visual storytelling than anything. I mean, that's nothing about the system. It's nothing about the politics. It's nothing about that. It's just, we're going to tell a story within a scene without any dialogue. Any dialogue is just going to be them swearing. But you can piece together a crime scene from just this one clip.
I know you're a big fan of the opening scene of the show as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I think, I'm going to be honest, right? It's because when you told me about how you started watching The Wire and you kind of wanted to get me into it and finish the show so we could talk about it, the scene that I wanted to go back and rewatch the most was the opening scene. That's only because I love the opening credits and I love that song and I love the way that it leads onto it. And I think what makes that first scene as good as it is it's a conversation between McNulty and this one person who you never see again. But it establishes the tone of the show so well that I go back to it and I think, this is The Wire, right? I mean, you can watch 5 seasons of TV, but if you want to introduce someone to the show, I don't even think there's a scene better than that first scene. And it's that line that it ends with. It's him saying, "Got to. This is America, man." And it's the way that McNulty kind of like, his eyes bulge a little bit and he kind of goes, wow, yeah, he's kind of right. And he almost kind of sniggers as well because it's very true. And then it's the main theme starts. And it's
season 1 main theme is brilliant. You've got the Omar stuff. I mean, we've talked about him as a character, why he's so great. But so many great moments, there's your introduction to him kind of bursting in and kind of robbing people. And that's his relationship with, is it Brandon?
Brandon, yeah.
Yeah, and kind of what happens to Brandon. That incredible ending of an episode where they've got the wire up, but no one's on it yet. And you follow the trail of Wallace seeing Brandon making the call. And following it through the wire, and then you find out in the next episode, if we'd caught this, they would have got them. And then that motivates Omar. You have comment for the king you best not miss.
Yeah, that scene's excellent.
Incredible line.
Yeah, I think what I really like about that scene that you were just talking about, where you see the process that people go through to kind of communicate, pretty much. It starts with Wallace noticing Brandon, and then calling D'Angelo pages Bell. I can't remember the exact process, but it all comes full circle. But I think what makes another thing that I really like about The Wire is that I feel like you don't really get that much action, right? A lot of the crimes that you see, a lot of the killings especially, take place off screen. They'll set them up, and then you'll see the aftermath. But the physical act of killing, you just don't see very often. And you have that with Brandon, and you also have that with Sobotka in Series 2. And I think it speaks more volume.
Yeah,
right?
I think something like Sopranos didn't have as many, but it did have those big hits. So like Game of Thrones was like something that would be put. They'd show the episodes at bars and people would cheer in the action scenes and stuff. You could never put The Wire on in a bar. It's too quiet, contemplative.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the show is people in rooms talking and having conversations. I think per season, now that I think about it, you get a few shootouts. But in terms of, I guess, the blockbuster parts of the show, it's kind of minimal. And I think it's a lot less than you'd expect going into a show like The Wire.
So I think this might be the weakest part about season 5. That it is a bit more blockbuster. It's a bit more preposterous. There's a bit more crazy action scenes. There's a few characters meeting that wouldn't naturally meet. I think.
But I guess that's because it's the final season. It has to kind of be explosive and volatile.
I think to get to its ending, which is a phenomenal ending, it has to kind of jump through hoops to get to that point. And I feel like I think they might have lost like a key member of the writing staff as well, which kind of maybe they lost Ed Burns for season 5. But I mean, we're talking about season 1. We got some fucking great things coming up. And I think season 2, it's different. It's different. It's a lot whiter. For one, maybe partly that might have been the reason that HBO were like, shit, like, we're going to count. The only reason we won't cancel the show is if you put more white characters into fucking marketing or whatever, which I hope, because that's a lot more cynical.
Yeah, it was funny. I watched the David Simon Q&A where he talked about why The Wire wasn't a hit initially, and I think a lot of what he was trying to say was pretty much that it's a show about African Americans. I said earlier, there's only a handful of white characters in the show. People are skipping through the channels. They see a show and they see black characters on the screen, and if they're white, they think, oh, it's not a show for us, and they'll just kind of skip on because it's not really their story.
Especially at this time, with these years of propaganda about like drug dealers in your neighborhood, and like just completely like, oh, these people are evil, they're immoral, and it's kind of it's humanizing them, It's presenting the honest truth that why
people don't really want to face that.
Why people get in the game, like. Characters like Bodhi that might do something horrible. They are human beings. They've got no other options. It's really, it's a very humanizing show of everyone involved in the drug trade.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned a minute ago how if they'd been on The Wire up like a day earlier, they would have got them all because they had the conversation where Stringer goes to Brandon and all of that. And you have a lot of really great moments like that where it's kind of like a last second, God, they were so close, but they kind of just missed that. Someone wasn't up on that balcony watching someone was using the phone call, probably because Herc and Carver were off doing something stupid, so they weren't there to actually see it. And you get moments like that in Series 1 and Series 2 where Wallace is about to kind of testify, but they don't do a good enough job protecting him. It's always like, we'll get your statement, but it's going to be tomorrow, and it's already too late at that point. Sobotka's the same. I mean, his death in Series 2 it speaks so much because it is really tragic, right? I mean, he almost kind of fulfilled his purpose to basically just say, right, this is all too much. I need to just rat out the Greeks now and kind of try and help my own son. But it always has to be that day later, right? You can't talk to us today because there's an administrative or bureaucratic process that means that we can't get your statement today. It has to be tomorrow, right? You get caught up in it's the system, right? You get caught up in these annoying, really frustrating processes, and people lose their lives for it.
And season 2 continues that, but I think we'll talk about it seamlessly for the podcast for another day. Is it's class, it's about unions, the death of unions, the working class, like the death of American industry. We're in America, working class jobs are kind of going. There's less and less of them, and
they're being replaced by automation for one thing.
Yeah, and it kind of, I feel like it does a really good job of introducing you to this new world that's different. Explains it a lot. It presents like the idea of unions being involved in crimes again, like a hot button talking point in American politics of like, oh, these unions are corrupt. That's why there's less and less American unions than ever before. Where it really is like, but the reason they are corrupt is because they don't. That's the only way they can survive.
Yeah, I mean, it's
oversee these horrific things like human trafficking. It's like
it's like how with each season it's a different group of people, but it's always the same story. It's always they have to because they've got no other income. I mean, this is what they have to do in order to kind of get ahead and try and fend for themselves. Where their jobs are going down the toilet, they're getting less and less days' work. They kind of have to do these things, sort of don't ask questions, and it kind of is immoral because people are getting fucked over in the process. But in the first series, it's about a group of kids and almost teenagers and kind of young adults, and in this one, it's a lot of it is Polish dock workers and union workers, but it's the same story.
Yeah,
it's the same story. It's about poverty. It's about impoverished communities having to try and do what they can to take care of themselves and their family. And
I think it's also who's profiting off this. Like these kind of you kind of introduce in this series like the nebulous villains that are making the money off this. Like the characters like the Greek who are very kind of vague and ambiguous as to what they're the people. There's got to be a reason that people are suffering because of these drugs, and the reason is because people are profiting. You get more of a sense of that in season 2, but we should probably wait until we talk about it more.
Yeah, probably. I think if I probably had one last point, I would say that talking to you about the first season now reminded me about a lot of plot elements that don't get left unattended to. You do see Clay Davis in the first series, and you do get that whiff of the money in the first series, but that doesn't get left unresolved. That comes back and plays a massive part in what I'm now seeing in season 5. Nothing gets left behind. I really, really like that.
Like even like you see Proposition Joe a few times, and he becomes a bigger and bigger part of the show.
Oh, we've not even really talked about the last few episodes of series 1, which are probably the best. It all starts off with that basketball game, which is, I think, it's maybe the first really great episode of the show where I think they first get their eyes on Avon properly. There's that fantastic part where Avon drives past Tam and he just wags his finger at him. I love that. And then later on in that episode, I think Omar tries to shoot him as well, but Avon manages to duck out of the way. And then you get, I think in the next episode, you get probably maybe even the scene that I remembered so well. Going back to watch the show, which is Kima being shot, because that's a really big part of that season, kind of the aftermath and trying to deal with that. I remember how they kind of try and get together and sort of really get their knuckles down to try and catch Avon so well. It was just really stuck in my mind. We better talk about Bubs as well, right? We probably still have more to say about season 1.
We got to end it there. And we can bring up season 1 when we talk about season 2, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. So bad.
Yeah,
Instantaneously, we're talking about season 2 of The Wire.
It's the one everyone hates, either.
It's the controversial one, for sure.
The level.
And when I finished the first 2 seasons the first time around, even I can understand why a little bit. We talked about it already on this podcast, but it's because it's so tangential, isn't it? You kind of get used to this case where it's going to be the task force versus the drug trade, and it's going to be about kind of West Baltimore more than anything. And then this second series kind of comes out of nowhere and says, you know what, we'll put that to one side. It'll still be in the background, but we'll focus on a completely different story, a different aspect of the drug trade.
Yeah, we've got the ports, got the Sobotkas.
Yeah, the Sobotkas are they're really good characters. I do like them. Frank especially. I think Frank is another kind of D'Angelo type character where I think he means really well and he's got a good heart, but sometimes the decisions that he makes aren't always the best. And, through one lens, he could be seen as a criminal or someone who is doing bad things, but in reality he is just trying to stay afloat like the rest of them. Although I think more than anything, actually, Nikki is the character who you get the most of that content with, because you see a bit of his private life. You see that he's got a wife and child, and he's trying to support them as well as himself. And she wants a new apartment, and she just wants better things. And as the season goes on, especially with the fact that there's a criminal investigation happening at their dockyard, he's getting less and less days, and his job that he does full time is it just virtually doesn't exist anymore. And that's the same with a lot of characters. They don't have shifts that day to work.
Well, you got definitely with Nikki. I think they do a really good job of like you understand why someone would do kind of crimes basically, because it's pretty much the only way he would be able to make enough money to kind of, I don't know, have a comfortable middle class life, which is just kind of his aim.
And Ziggy's a good character as well. Well, yeah, okay, I see why I understand why you pulled that. I think
with Ziggy, it's like I heard so much that he was a bad character that he just wasn't as bad as I thought he was.
Okay.
So in that sense, I think he's good. But if in the context of The Wire as a TV show, if I was doing my character rankings of main characters, not side characters, Ziggy would be very low. I think he is not pleasant to be around, really.
Yeah, I'd probably have to say, he definitely gets better. I think he has a really empathetic last few episodes with him.
Do you want to watch some of those early episodes with him again? Like,
not really.
The episode I rewatched with you was like a really bad Ziggy one.
Yeah, it's the one with cheese, isn't it?
Yeah.
God, that one's really, really terrible. And he's a huge fuck up. There's no doubt about it. And actually, his relationship with both his father and his cousin is actually really interesting in that regard, because obviously he's a loved one and you got to look out for him, but it's really hard to do anything effectively when you got this person who's kind of making it much more difficult. Yeah, he kind of is Fredo. And then he has that almost very predictable arc of kind of going, I don't like being on the sidelines anymore. I don't like being treated by a child. I'm going to try and do things my way. He kind of moves away from Nick for a bit towards the end, but obviously it all goes wrong because he's just not a self-managing character.
Well, his if we're talking more of like, we're going to talk about individual characters and their arcs rather than the season arc. The turning point where he is kind of undermined by that Greek guy they're dealing with, and he like walks to his car, gets a gun, walks in and shoots him. Which is it a one shot? It feels like one. I remember it feeling very immediate.
I think the shaky cam adds to that feeling that it is a one shot. I think looking back, it's like he starts in the store, he follows him out to his car, he gets in, gets the gun, walks back in, kills those two guys.
I mean, that's like the moment that pivots on. That's a fantastically well done.
It is. What really adds to that is his performance, because I think up until that moment he's a character that he's an important character, but he's not one that you take seriously or one that you can consider having range. He is kind of more or less the guy who gets annoyed for being stepped over a lot of the time and not being taken seriously at all. You know, the people that he works with, they all treat him like he's a joke. He has no respect at all. But then in this one scene, he basically comes along, does something that kind of has irreparable consequences. But the way that the actor carries it off is really, really great. I mean, it affects him. In a later scene where he goes and talks to Jay in Homicide about what he's done when he turns himself in. Or maybe he doesn't turn himself in, but I think it's obvious that he's done it.
I think he might turn himself in, actually.
Yeah, I know that he doesn't deny it or anything. He's more than willing to go along with it and say, yeah, I've got to take responsibility for this. And maybe that's why I kind of like Ziggy more, because it's always the aftertaste that you get left with. It's always how it ends up that character that tends to be in your mind when you're thinking of them. And I think what they do with Ziggy towards the end of that season is really brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good ending for the character. And obviously, when you were rewatching season 2, you were talking to me about Frank Savotka. And if he comes back.
Yeah, that was great. I can't remember what I typed into Google, but it was related to Frank Savotka or something like that. Oh, I remember what I typed in. It was, does Frank Savotka return into the show? And that's when that's when I found out that there wasn't really anything to do with that. And I talked to you about it, and you kind of pulled this face, and I was,
I can't believe you didn't remember. It's such a tragic death, just because it's the Wallace thing. It's the point where he's gonna help, but then it can't be today. and then he goes to hear them out about what they can do for Ziggy. You know.
Yeah, in typical Wire fashion, you can anticipate it, I think, before it's happened, but it's not in a way where it feels like, oh, I've pretty much just guessed what's going to happen now, so I'm going to stop watching or anything like that. And looking back, I think when we talked about why I'd stopped watching the show the first time around, I think I must have just tried to erase Frank's death from my memory because it was so tragic.
It's very effective because it's not, you don't see it on screen, it's you going there.
Yeah.
And the Spiros gets the call as he's walking towards them, and the episode ends, and the next episode is his body being found by the dog workers. I think that's what kind of makes it.
Yeah, and it just affects everyone at the scene. It is really good. It is really good. I can just imagine someone watching that episode when it airs and having to wait a full week to see what actually happens, even though his death is kind of inevitable at this point. Especially since, as he's pulling up to the Greeks, the guy who's in charge of it turns to Spiros and says, "Your way, it's not going to work, I'm afraid."
Yeah.
His death is definitely coming, but having to wait that week and then see what happens as a result of it must have been difficult. I think when it first aired.
Jumping around, I think what we should talk about as well is the first episode of Series 2, which I think is fantastic actually. I think the first two episodes are really good at kind of letting you know where everyone is and what the stakes are for this new season. But it's the moment, the inciting incident, I guess, when Beatrice finds all the girls in the bodies kind of in that shipping container, which is kind of, I guess, the thing that started.
And we talked about this, and you and even I think I agree that's the best first episode of the season of the show. It is fantastic. It is really, really fantastic. And also, I think the first and second series, the reason that we've done them both as kind of one episode of the podcast is because they are very, very similar. In actually a lot of the ways, it kind of sounds like a ridiculous phrase when you consider that the first season is about the Barksdales, and this is about the Sobotkas and the Greeks. But it still has that very kind of focused feeling of, this is an investigation, and we're going to follow the task force, and we're going to follow the Greeks, and you see a bit of outside stuff with Avon and Stringer and D'Angelo.
I guess what you'd say is that season one has only the A and the B plot of these organisations, whereas this you have the A and the B, and then you've got that great C plot of what's going on.
Exactly, whereas Series 3 kicks things into second gear, and that's when it becomes, I guess...
whole alphabet.
Yeah, exactly. That's when it really does become a show that just tries to take every angle that it can on a specific topic. The Series 2 is very much, this is the investigation that we're doing, and we're just going to try and show it happen almost as in real time as the first season, where I really love the first few episodes because it makes complete sense that the task force has been disassembled. They've all been kind of shipped off back to where they started, and in some cases, McNulty, he's even worse off than where he started. He's a patrolman.
Yeah, he's kind of on the boat.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of like that it takes 3 or 4 episodes for this to actually come back together and for things to meet. Because originally it's kind of 2 different cases. Because I know Prez starts off with a few people the Valchek organises. And he's looking
should we talk about how that happened?
Yeah. Really quickly, he's looking into Savotka, and then completely. Meanwhile, that's going on. You have Bunk and Lester looking into the containers, and then Daniels gets involved when Prez's investigation is like, well, the people I'm working with, they're all shit, they're bad policemen. And then when those both kind of merge together, and you realise that there's a massive overlap between the two, it's really satisfying when that core cast from the first series is now back together, and McNulty's back as well, and he's doing what he does best. But the way that it starts is so brilliant. I mean, it's so funny because I've completely forgotten why Valchek has this sort of motivation to try and go for Sobotka, but it's so petty, isn't it? And that's the great thing.
The stained glass window. Yeah, and with the stuff with Valchek in this season, it is like stepping up its kind of criticism of the police. We said, like in season 1, there's almost unseeable forces, which are kind of represented by Burrell. But in this season, you get more. So you get interactions between Valchek and Burrell, which is kind of what leads to the task force kind of being formed. Mainly it's to get at Sobotka, but then they kind of tie it into the bodies. And then with the bodies, you've got the McNulty is trying to fuck over rules by pinning all these bodies that have been found on as murders, and then those murders kind of being tied in. But the reluctance to kind of every police that you kind of in this season more than any, you've got all these police officers in different departments and different units, and they're all trying to not do their jobs basically. Because of the clearance rate, which is probably the first time you hear about the clearance rate as well.
And I think it's such a big part of the Wire, that obsession with stats and that. And I mean, Rawls is probably maybe the most. He's like the epitome of that. I mean, those first few episodes, the lengths that he'll go to not have to deal with that container full of the dead victims. It's just, I mean, it's abhorrent. Is what it is. And the fact that McNulty has to go out of his way, and he's not even really doing it because he wants someone to do it. He just wants to fuck over Rawls from the previous season. And going back to what you were saying a second ago with Valchek and Brawl and their kind of dynamic in the second season, it all goes back to that kind of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's always, you've got to give a favour to do a favour.
Yeah, it's like trying to get promotions, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it's Brella's up for being commissioner, right? But he needs, I think, some voters in the southeastern district, or it's something like that. And Valchek is the one who says that, yeah, okay, I will do this for you, but in return, I want you to set up this investigation to look at Sobotka, and I also want Daniels in charge for the Barksdale case.
You also got like a fair amount of nepotism in this season, because not only with Valchek and Presbalewski, but you've also got the Sobotkas. You've got Ziggy, who's just like completely kind of incompetent in the same way that you'd say Presbalewski is in certain areas of the police department, and they're kind of, I guess they need something to do. They're kind of forced into this line of work, and they have positions they shouldn't really hold because of nepotism.
Yeah, definitely. Should we talk a little bit about D'Angelo and Stringer and Avon as well? So D'Angelo then comes to him about halfway through series 2. And we've already touched upon this a little bit, but what really... the thing about D'Angelo's death, the reason that it really affected me so much the first time round, maybe more so the first time round, I think his death might have even been my biggest takeaway from the first 2 seasons for a good 3 or 4 years before I revisited the show. But I think the real impact behind his death is the fact that he is like so many characters who are trying to kind of make a new life for himself, move away from what's pretty much been the biggest source of negativity in his life. But because he doesn't play by the rules, but in kind of...
Well, it's not even that he's not playing by the rules. He's like, he isn't going to talk, but they don't know that he's not going to talk,
Yeah, there's always that possibility.
It's just he's killed for a possibility, even though he probably wouldn't.
Yeah. I guess more what I'm trying to say is he's not playing by the organisation's rules, he's not playing by Barksdale's rules, he's trying to kind of just move away from it as much as he can. And as he tries to do that, suddenly he's almost seen as a liability, isn't he? He's not someone that you can watch over, someone that you can kind of look after and supervise. And I have no doubt in my mind that D'Angelo was never going to rat on him. He just wanted to do his 20 years, get out on parole when he has that chance. But there wasn't any possibility, I think, of him ever actually changing his mind. But because there's that possibility there that's in place, he had to go. It's really, really sad.
I think it's kind of the most, probably the moment that's, I mean, actually Wallace's death as well. But Stringer kind of just gets worse and worse, I guess I should say. And you kind of, I guess you follow him quite a lot in this season too, right? Because he's the most senior member of the organisation out. So you follow him kind of trying to set things up, holding kind of meetings with all his dealers. You kind of see that he you see more of him trying to become a legitimate business, trying to apply the things he learned to those
well,
seminars.
He has those meetings with all of his dealers to try and make sure everyone's on the same page and there's like a sense of organisation.
Because they hold the towers, but they don't have any products really that's good.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of like the birth of the co-op, isn't it?
It is the birth of the co-op.
With Prop Joe, he kind of comes along and says, look, you've got the distribution, you've got the local locations, you've got the towers, the projects, but I've got the product. And if we go into a co-op...
and Avon's reluctance to give up the towers for the product is made redundant by the fact in season 3 the towers get knocked down. So it almost kind of shows that Avon's almost stuck in the past in that way. And because of the towers being knocked down, it becomes a corner game again. And Stringer isn't kind of cut out for a corner game, really. And that's kind of how Marlowe comes in season 3, I think.
Yeah, I think there's kind of like, there's that sort of weakness now that someone can come along and exploit.
Because he's in the towers, you could see that even off screen, even though it's not really in the show, Marlowe was probably like, he had a few corners in season 2. He was kind of coming up. And then as soon as like, suddenly the entire game's being moved into the areas that Marlowe's already in, that's kind of where he comes from.
Yeah. There's also towards the end, Brother Muzone. He's quite a fun character.
He is.
I'll give him that. We've talked about this outside the podcast a little bit, and I'd say Muzone is a character that I love watching on screen. There's no doubt about that. I mean, he is fun. He's very different to any character in the show. He really does stand out, both physically and with his kind of mentality and the way that he talks. But if I had one flaw, we've already mentioned this, is that there's something about him that feels like it shouldn't really exist in kind of, I guess, Baltimore or in The Wire. I know you have this a little bit with Bunk as well, when he kind of smokes this cigar and there's something a little bit too stylized about it. When you see Muzone, and he's almost kind of a mythological figure at that point, because you've had an episode saying, oh shit, you're going to bring the brother to Baltimore. Just every character knows who Muzone is when you mention his name. And he comes along and he kind of has these massive rectangular glasses and the kind of well-pressed suit and the bow tie especially.
But it almost feels a little bit cynical in the way of like, let's create like an instantly iconic character in his design, and having all the really like tough characters talk about how tough he is, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas Omar kind of feels like more natural and like real in the world.
Oh, definitely.
Whereas
definitely.
I don't think my brother Muzone is like. I mean, I don't think he exists like in the way Omar exists in the real world.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine someone walking around with like a gel cap, a shotgun, a black cloak, robbing drug dealers. That's something that's very conceivable to me. But someone coming along with this small pine pistol and the bow tie, he's almost like a clown in that sense. I don't think there's something gritty enough about him. You know, I look back at the first series and I look at like kind of the muscle that Barksdale has, and I think about Bird and Stinkham and Weebay, and I think how they're all ordinary and they're not iconic characters, but they're definitely characters that feel like they just exist, and they're different enough that I can kind of separate them in my head, whereas Muzone kind of stands out too much and it's almost just absurd.
Yeah. You mentioned Bird. I think we should talk about the
Gantt trial.
The Gantt trial.
Yeah, I love how, I think this is probably the first moment in the show where I kind of go, all right, this is kind of just a bit funny and almost slapstick at this point. How it takes about 3 or 4 episodes of a 12-episode season of Bunk just going up to McNulty every time he's seeing him and saying, "You got a line on Omar? Yeah, I need a line on Omar. I got to get him for that Gantt trial. I've got Unetta calling me every 5. I can't remember if it's Unetta, but it makes me laugh every time that I think back to all those scenes. McNulty doesn't get off his ass to do anything.
Eventually, he gets Bubs on it because he catches Bubs coming out of the supermarket.
Yeah, it's absolutely
completely
right.
Coincidentally.
And then they eventually do get a line on Omar. He's kind of back in Baltimore after having taken a bus out at the end of the first series, I think.
Yeah, he put someone on a bus to New York.
Yeah, and he's back. In fact, I actually think that's how the first season ends, doesn't it? The last thing that you see is him stepping out of like an alleyway and saying something. He doesn't say "I'm back," but he is back.
Yeah,
and he just robs someone at gunpoint.
Something like that.
Yeah. And that trial is so funny.
Yeah.
You've got it.
Well, you've got the setup of Omar being back and like him test, like they kind of test him out as a witness before, and him kind of like laughing at that, and then being told he can't wear that, he has to wear something with a tie. Then the scene where he goes to the shop with McNulty to buy him a suit, and then the reveal of at the start of the trial, Omar being there wearing his normal outfit with just a tie.
Yeah, well, it's not even properly done up. He's pretty much just throwing it around his neck.
Yeah, it's an incredibly funny scene.
Yeah, because you got Levy, who's probably one of the most despicable characters in the show.
It's like a criminal lawyer.
Yeah, someone who seems like he has the upper hand, but Omar's just kind of there, almost treating this entire case as like a one massive joke, and it's really, really funny.
It definitely shows, like, when you hear David Simon talk about like the real Omar and how if you just looked at his rap sheet, you think this guy's a monster. Then if you actually know the guy and like what he did, like he is kind of a hero. And like you've got that in the trial, right? They're trying to present Omar by like his rap sheet, like the criminal acts he's done. But really, like it's what we know about Omar is kind of clashing against this kind of society's idea of what he is, and that just creates a lot of kind of humour.
It does, and I mean the pinnacle of that scene is the part where he points out the hypocrisy of the lawyer, where it's kind of like we're both in the same game, it's just different angles, and I'm no worse than you are just because I go around wielding a shotgun. You got the briefcase.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably the most iconic scene from the season in terms of the comedy.
Yeah, I'd definitely say so. And another thing that I thought was really funny is how I think the second season starts off with I think almost the first time that you see McNulty is him talking to Bunk saying, me and my ex-wife are going to patch things up together this season. That's like his arc. And then a few episodes later, it's almost like a shock that they're not going to get back together, and I just love that so much.
I do kind of like those scenes together. But
oh yeah,
that one with the doll,
the mannequin. Yeah, that is very amusing.
I agree. Yeah, it's pretty good. Do you want to talk about like the main plot? So we've said about
we should talk about the Greeks and Speros a little bit.
We've said about they finding the body and like kind of assembling the team takes a while, but like should we talk? I guess the point when they've assembled the team and what they're up against.
Yeah, so when both cases merge together, the container full of the dead victims, and then the investigation into Sobotka and where's this money come from? I mean, he's just a dock worker. How is he earning this much? The way that they kind of merge together is Daniels tries to keep them separate for a while, doesn't he? Because he doesn't want to. Because I think Daniels' angle for a lot of the season is if he does what Valchek wants to be done, then he gets the promotion from Burrell. But Rawls is coming along and saying, look, you're already looking into this, why don't you just take the bodies off of me? And Daniels is very hesitant to do that because he knows that it's going to be an added complication that he doesn't want.
Daniels, because of his actions in season 1, is like stuck in the basement at the start. Yeah. It's like his wife kind of wants him to retire. And obviously you've kind of got that. The Kima wants to retire. Kima's partner wants her to retire. You got that great scene where they're both telling their partners at dinner that they're going back in, the camera's kind of spinning around. Which is like the one flashy thing I didn't know why it does. It's really the only stylized thing.
Every shot in The Wire is either the camera's in lockdown or it's kind of moving around a character as they're speaking at a very slow pace.
Or like a handheld for a special shot. But that's the one stylized thing. So it's kind of the one instance of Daniels not kind of doing the right thing in order to kind of try and play the political game of moving up out of the basement. But because it's Daniels, he does do the right thing. He does take the bodies on, as part of the investigation, help Bunk out because it's Bunk and Lester are partners at the start, right? And they're trying to work the case together. But then Lester gets put in major crimes.
Yeah, and as the case progresses, what eventually happens is it kind of ends with the cops being very close to getting them, but then their whole operation shuts down completely because they get wind of it, don't they?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, again, with The Wire explaining things that they explain. They use computers to track what's coming off the docks, and they kind of clone the computer, and instead of like a wire, you're almost like they're watching the parcels go. And what does shut it down? Is it something they do to alert them?
I'm trying to think. It might be related to the fact that Sobotka's son gets imprisoned, and that's enough to make them go, right, we just need to take this very cautiously. Because there are a few episodes in the midway through the season where they have just started becoming a lot more cautious because of reasons I can't.
Yeah, they're like quite close to getting them. Also, I think it's the first example of like the Greeks using mobile phones and stuff.
Oh, I've just remembered what shuts them down. It's the guy in the FBI, isn't it?
It is.
In DC, I think.
Yeah, you've got this kind of unknowable villain almost with the Greek, who's kind of very mysterious. And then you've got like his kind of relative who works in the FBI, so his associate who works in the FBI. And you kind of see a scene with him and like a bunch of other people who are potentially kind of profiting off the kind of West Coast drug trade. But you don't know anything about them. I mean, at the end, the Greek and the Spirits, they get away. you know, and then his final line, I'm not even Greek. You know, the one thing you know about this guy is he's an old Greek guy. But it turns out he's not even
He's
Greek.
Portuguese, yeah. I think what's really cool is the fact that this character that we just mentioned about, because you see him a few times and it's always like, kind of, he's at his laptop and then this notification will pop up on his laptop in kind of a very sort of, whatever, kind of way, alerting him what a development is in the case that's happening over in...
And that's how they find out Frank's the Bog. He gets put into
Yeah. But I find it quite interesting that from the moment where that character gets introduced all the way to the end, I just assumed that he was corrupt, or he was just an inside man for the Greek. But by the end of the season, you find out that it's actually not like that at all, and that the Greek is like an asset to an investigation, or he's an asset to the FBI in some kind of way, which almost legitimizes the whole reason why the FBI alerts him. Right? I mean, that guy is obviously kind of dodgy, but
I always thought he was kind of tied to him. Yeah, they're kind of tied together somehow.
Yeah, but it's kind of like, you know how you have informants and people like that who work for these organizations like the CIA, the FBI, and the States, and they always get immunity in some way because they're deemed as an asset to an investigation or an asset to something. So I imagine the Greek was in some way benefiting the FBI. I don't know the specifics, but it's interesting that I assume that he was corrupt, but actually there is a legitimate angle to it where this guy is an asset. That's something that Fitzhugh discovers in the last couple of episodes, because he kind of has he has this this kind of hunch almost, and he follows it up and he finds out that this guy that he thought was working somewhere has actually been somewhere else for like a few years now. I can't remember what the character's name is, but that's the one who is constantly keeping the Greek one step ahead of the police by literally letting him know where they've got up to in their investigation.
And those scenes when you go and see that character, it's always like you always get shown like how advanced like the FBI's surveillance equipment is and how they're only interested in terrorism cases, terrorism and corruption.
Yeah, Fitzhugh only. It's at times it feels like Fitzhugh only exists to come along and say, look, we can't help you with this. Unless it's related to counter-terrorism or political corruption, there's nothing we can do. It's almost a joke at this point.
Alright, anything else from Series 2 you really want to talk about?
We've not really talked about Herc and Carver at all on the podcast.
We haven't mentioned them, not really.
No, I think I mentioned Herc briefly once, but we've not really talked about Carver much. They have a couple of funny moments in this.
Well, season 1, they're kind of they're incompetent, you know, they're kind of they're brash, they're corrupt. They're basically they're bad cops, you know. And at the start of season 2, they're kind of split up, right? I know Carver is just kind of working as just like a uniform officer. I didn't remember what Herc was, but
I don't know if Herc was doing anything in particular. I think maybe even the first time you see him in the second series might be when he gets pulled on to the task force. Actually, I mean, you see him for those first few episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I think don't they try and steal money and then don't get away with it? I know that Carver, it turns out at the end of series 1 was kind of ratting on the investigation.
To Burrell.
Yeah, giving information. There's that scene where he gets put back on where Daniels is like, don't kind of do that again. And as the show goes on, I mean, Carver gets better and Herc gets worse, almost.
Yeah, they do end up going their different paths morally, for sure. I think Herc and Carver a lot of the time are kind of intended as comic relief a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, especially in the second series, there's a really funny episode where he buys a camera and he has to leave a credit card. But then they put... No, it's not a camera, it's a mic, and they put it in a tennis ball. And I think they
just ran over or something.
Yeah. Is it like White Mike, or is it Cheese? It's one of those two who picks it up, I think, and just chucks it, and he gets squashed by a lorry.
Yeah. Because they try and do that. That's the first time you see Fuzzy Dunlop, right? They're trying to... They are using illegal surveillance equipment to put it down to a confidential...
Yeah, and I love how Fuzzy Dunlop is out that comes back in
series 4, it's even worse, because they try it on Milo.
Yeah, it just does not go their way at all.
Well, so, I mean, we've not talked about Lester that much.
But Lester's just kind of great, and that's all there is.
But I guess, like, Series 1, Lester, the plot twist that he's great, and then you find out his origin story, that he, like, fucked over a superior, and has spent this time in his basement for years, you know, waiting for his chance, you know. And that's the thing about that. He's incredibly kind of patient. That's his kind of character.
But I think one of the most important parts of what makes Lester such a great detective is that there's this fantastic line in series 4, I think, when he's looking at the vacants with Bunk and they're kind of looking around that park, and I think it clicks in Lester's head where all these bodies have been going. And he says something, no, maybe Bunk says something to him rather than him saying something to Bunk, but it's definitely one of those two who says, you've been looking at this one tree the whole time, what you need to be doing is looking at the forest. And I think Lester's really great at kind of seeing the bigger picture, whereas you got, I think, Herc and Carver are almost polar opposites. They're like, I think Herc especially, he's just not fitted to be an investigator or detective. I mean, he's a police officer. I don't think he has the patience, and I don't think he has the intelligence or that instinct to do detective work in the same way Lester can, where Lester's interested in finding that network, in finding how everything connects, and that's what makes him great. That's what makes Prez really good as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of their relationship. And for series 2, you've got the Prez and Valchik kind of standoff as well. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, I do. I remember the part where Prez punches him in the face quite well. That was quite funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see what else is there. Bunk, he kind of gets put onto the investigation. Beatrice, Edie Russell, I mean, she's kind of a new character for the season, but kind of is never really used in the same way again, which is a shame, but she's kind of great.
She's a really good character.
A kind of small-time cop who just works the beat of the pier and then discovers the bodies, which is another kind of really kind of impactful scene. I like McNulty's stuff because he's on the boat. He's almost just doing investigations for himself. Like he
has a really good first half of the season where he's just trying to find the identity of that woman that he found in the liver.
I mean, that is like a not so subtle way of the show kind of telling us about kind of human trafficking in America and like the horrific kind of conditions people are brought in and like the exploitation and kind of touching upon that element, kind of how it's not only drugs that are coming in, but like people are being trafficked. And that scene where they McNulty has to go undercover as an English person. Which is a fair play to Dominic West, being an Englishman doing an American, trying to do an Englishman badly. Which is like, there's a lot of layers to that.
It's very funny.
When he does his like English accent. Yeah, that's a good scene.
Yeah, it is a good scene. There were a couple of things else that I wanted to talk about. I just can't remember. I think you mentioned Beadie a minute ago, actually, and I really like what they do with her character in the second series because towards the end, she has this kind of like shining moment where her knowledge of the docs really helps the investigation a lot, and she's actually the one who encourages Frank from an emotional perspective to come in and say what he knows, and he ends up dying for it because the Greeks find out that he talked to the police. And I think she really takes that quite hard in that final episode a lot, doesn't she?
Yeah, definitely. Is that it? Have we finished season 2? We're going to finish this and then you're going to say, like, oh, we have like a million things we can talk about.
Yeah. I feel like we've talked about most of the characters. I'd say, I kind of want to talk about Bubs a little more, actually. Because I think something that I've noticed about his character over the seasons is his relationship with the police and the people who kind of, basically the people that he's a CI for. And I think there is nothing more powerful from Bubs' perspective than what happens in Series 4, where it's just like the bottom of the bottom for him. But there is something kind of, I think it's quite subtle a lot of the time, but you do pick it up more as the show goes on. The way they treat Bubs as a person it's always to do with, they always kind of talk to him. Kima's meant to be his friend, right? But Kima only kind of makes that first move when she needs something from him.
Yeah.
And it is a little bit the other way as well. But it's kind of interesting how all of these characters know how bad Bubs' drug addiction is, but no one really helps him out as a friend. They're kind of just happy to let him carry on having this addiction because it means they have a great CI for the foreseeable future. And I think McNulty especially, I'm trying to remember this moment, I can't remember, I think it might be in Series 2 when he's talking to Bubs, and there's this level of like, of neglect and dismissiveness that he has.
When he puts him in the line of danger to kind of get Omar, doesn't it, as well? Like,
yeah, he does do that, and he kind of doesn't really treat him as a person, but he treats him more as something that he can just use if he needs it as a tool. And actually, in the first series, another thing that we forgot to talk about is Bubs actually thinks of getting clean, doesn't he? And the show tries to highlight how effective it is when you're surrounded by people who kind of care, because Bubs is so close to getting clean. Ali's closer than it looks like he has been for a really long time. But where he falls down is he doesn't have anyone to kind of look after him. He needs Kima for something. It's money or a place to stay or something like that. But I think she gets wounded at that exact moment.
And he's on the bench.
Yeah, and then in a couple of episodes later, he's pretty much back to square one because he didn't have that support network. And I think that's another really great statement about what it's like for people who are suffering from drug addictions. They need kind of friends and family to be there for him, to help him through this. He needs support, and when that support was absent, it wasn't enough to just have that kind of that self-conviction. You need other people around, and he's by the end of series 1, not much has changed for him, even though he did have that kind of spark in those drug meetings. Remember the ones with Johnny? That's where he kind of gets this. He gets this kind of motivation for the first time, it seems, to actually try and get himself clean.
Yeah. Also, I think in the docks, where we haven't really talked about, like when the police come down, you kind of hear the whistles, and you really get the sense that this is like the death of this union and the docks, and it's just because of automation, because of just the way the industry is working. There's less and less need for these docks. There's that kind of great one of. Obviously, not all the quotes are incredible, but there's one of the quotes that Spiros says where he's like, they used to make steel there now. And the kind of the death of American kind of labour in that sense is kind of leads to the death of the working class, which in this sense is leading to an increase in crime to kind of keep, I don't know, their lives going. Like the only way they can keep this dock alive is, and give people the hours they need, is to kind of turn a blind eye to some pretty horrific shit, you know. And the show's never like, oh, the stuff that the Greeks are doing is good, but you completely understand through like Nikki's story and through Frank's story why you would turning a blind eye is almost the only way to have enough money to keep your kind of men paid. And
Sabotka never asks questions either. I think when I watched the first episode back, there was a part of me that I kind of had this this nagging feeling in my head where I was like, does he know what it is they bring in each time? Because there's definitely the great thing about that first episode is it has that kind of maybe 5-10 minute part of it that's really, really tense, where that container is just there, isn't it? No one's come to pick it up. No, actually that's not true. Sergey or Sergeant or whatever he's called is there, but he's not moving it away. And all the dock workers who know about that container are just kind of standing there at the window watching it. Leave, please leave. And it was then that I was thinking the most, Sabotka, he must know what's in these containers, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense for him to be so kind of paranoid about I guess Russell doing one of our patrols and spotting the container. But by the end of the episode, you find out that actually you're right, it's just a complete blind eye. He has no knowledge of what's in these containers, but he can assume the worst.
It's 14. Is it 14 dead bodies? I can't remember, because in season 5 they talk about 22 dead bodies a lot. So, but
I think it is 14.
It's kind of, it's such a horrific kind of image, and in this, it's also the actual truth of what happened. It's a mystery that gets resolved pretty much instantly. Like I think at the end of episode 2, maybe.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is, because the Greek interrogates the guy who was working that ship, who knows about it.
And he ends up being killed. So like it's kind of the person who actually did this is kind of no longer here. And you also realise how hard it is to kind of convict criminals from overseas, from the United States, because not only can they just leave, but like there's that scene where they're holding that boat to interview people, and they're trying to grand jury them, but they won't talk, you know.
Yeah, and the ship has to sail like the next day, doesn't it? So their crime scene just leaves them. But yeah, I mean, isn't that like a big testimony to how great The Wire is? The mystery is solved from the second episode, but you carry on watching the season because every other part of the show, the investigation, the characters, that it's so engaging that you carry on anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, think with The Wire, it's not shocking television. It's not like, oh, I didn't see that coming. It's the satisfaction in seeing it happen. You know,
Yeah.
it's the we've explained everything, so you're going to watch this computer screen. You know what this means, and this leads to this, and it's the kind of slow build. Although it always culminates in a kind of bittersweet ending where Frank's dead. They get some people, not others. I think season 2 might even be the least successful investigation. I think they clear the bodies, right? But
they do. I think they get everyone apart from Spiros and Top Guy.
But
right?
I mean, they are the people.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, it is. And another really great thing about The Wire is that, and you touched upon this a little bit before actually, is how the show is really good at building from the first episode to maybe about 2/3 in, where it's kind of about moving pieces into place, right? And those last few episodes are dedicated to just pretty much everything that comes. It's about how shit goes down in those last few episodes. In the first series, you really get some of that, right? You get how it's kind of like it's building to something, and then you have that fantastic basketball episode, and then the episode after Kima gets shot, and then episode 12 is responding to that, and then 13 is where they actually get Avon. And it's just a series of 3 or 4 episodes that would not have had the same level of effect as if it had just been 4 episodes by themselves. You need that build up. It's the same thing in series 3 with Amsterdam. When you need those 3 or 4 episodes, you need that context. You need to see Bunny's kind of psychology a little bit, and why it is that he has to resort to setting up this system. It's really important.
Yeah, The Wire's finales are always phenomenal as well. I mean, the ending montages are great. I don't know, some people might think they're rushed. I think they're incredibly efficient at showing you. They run down the character list almost and show you everyone where they are, where they ended up, because each character at the end is kind of disbanded. Although season 2, Major Crimes is kind of kept, right? At the end of season 2.
Yeah, I think it's and that we'll talk about it when we do series 3 because I'm still not sure how I feel about it. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like it's a big problem. The task force, it's already kind of midway into the investigation from series 3, where you don't really have that series 1 and series 2 thing of like, now we got to start from scratch and kind of build up things from the bottom up.
I guess 5 does the same thing, right? Where you're like midway into an investigation. Yeah, but anyway. Okay, is that it? Is that The Wire?
Series 2, yeah.
Series 1 and Series 2, or seasons, if you're American. Thank you for listening to this almost 2-hour podcast.